Yes, folks, New Zealand and the West in general will soon be flooded with so-called climate change refugees. Now, we all know that the climate change hoax propagated by the far-left doomers is nothing more than a redistribution of wealth from first world nations to third world nations. But folks, it has just got a whole lot worse. It has also just become the transfer of people from the third world to the first world. The UN has just ruled it is unlawful to force climate refugees to return to their home countries. Anyway, hat tip to Mr. Maggots for this story. Now, folks, this article is from the ABC, and I've posted a link to the entire article in the description below. A landmark decision by the United Nations Human Rights Committee has found it unlawful to force climate refugees to return to their home countries. But the man at the centre of the case will not benefit. Kiribati man Ioni Titoto made international headlines in 2015 when he challenged his deportation from New Zealand for overstaying his work visa. In doing so, he sought to be the world's first climate refugee. Mr. Titoto had argued a sea level rise in Kiribati has resulted in the scarcity of habitable space, which has in turn caused violent land disputes that he said endangered his life, and that it made it difficult to access safe drinking water. But New Zealand's High Court, the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court all rejected his argument and allowed the deportation to go ahead. The UN Human Rights Committee considered a challenge brought by Mr. Titoto, and while the committee found he was not at imminent risk, it did find that such claims may be upheld in future as the impacts of climate change worsen. So the floodgates open. In a non-binding ruling this month, the committee found that governments must take into account climate-related human rights violations when they consider deporting asylum seekers. It is a decision legal experts said could pave the way for more claims from the Pacific. So what does non-binding mean? Well, it means binding if you belong to the globalist UN, like New Zealand does. Anyway, let's find out a bit more about this story. Now, guys, this guy here is Filippo Grandi, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees.
The United Nations ruled yesterday, in fact, that refugees affected by climate change cannot be returned to their countries under law, that they should be treated as regular refugees. What are the implications of that?
It's a very interesting ruling, because actually it's interesting because the ruling goes against the asylum request of this citizen of Kiribati, a state island in the Pacific, who sought asylum in New Zealand, saying that his country is facing disappearance, literally, and therefore he cannot be sent back. The ruling of this special body of the UN that is a custodian of human rights issues says, well, in this case, New Zealand is correct because there is no immediate threat, but if there was an immediate threat, this person should not be sent back. So it creates an important legal precedent. Now, whether this person is a refugee or not is a complicated issue. The important thing is that the ruling says if you have an immediate threat to your life due to climate change, due to a climate emergency, and if you cross a border and go to another country, you should not be sent back because you would be at risk of your life, just like in a war or in a situation of persecution or human rights violation. It's an interesting ruling that will allow us to further our discussion with states on this very complicated but important matter.
So in other words, force sovereign states to take in climate refugees. Anyway, now to some more propaganda.
Research shows that the Earth's climate is changing at a rate that's exceeded most scientific forecasts. Some communities have already started to suffer, and yet the term climate refugee does not actually exist in international law. A refugee is defined as a person who has crossed an international border, defined by the 1951 Convention as owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. But what if someone is a refugee within their own country's borders? The current scenes in Australia offer a glimpse into the future. Bushfires have been burning since September. Dozens of people have died. Forests and farmland the size of Bulgaria have been razed. Some blazes were so monstrous they created their own weather patterns, causing dry lightning and fire tornadoes.
We have noticed many extreme events, heat waves, floods that have impacted droughts, that have impacted people around the world in terms of migration of people.
It's entirely possible large parts of Australia will be uninhabitable in the decades to come. Even the Prime Minister appears to be changing his stance and acknowledging the climate crisis.
As a national initiative, we would, I think, want to have a high level of confidence that as a nation, we are improving our resilience and our adaptation to respond to the reality of the environment in which we live.
In 2018, extreme weather patterns such as severe drought in Afghanistan, tropical cyclone Gita in Samoa, and flooding in the Philippines all resulted in acute humanitarian needs. And it will get a lot worse. A 2018 report by the World Bank estimated that within the next 30 years, there would be 143 million climate refugees from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia alone.
Yeah, and all heading our way if the UN and their far-left minions like Jacinda Ardern get their way.
Internal climate migration will probably rise until 2050 and then accelerate, unless there are significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and robust development action.
Yes, so the clear message is this. The first world must stop developing and help the third world develop. Global socialism at work. Anyway, now to some common sense.
The United Nations has just declared climate-induced migration a human right, and frankly, I see a little bit of an opportunity here. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has adopted a resolution as part of the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights. The decision is 19 pages long, and it stems from the case of a Pacific Islander from a small island called the Republic of Kiribati, which is a place I didn't even know existed until now. Now, the man moved to New Zealand in 2007. By 2010, he and his family had overstayed their permits, and by May 2012, he tried to claim refugee status. He and his family were then deported in 2015 because, of course, there's no such thing as climate refugees, but also because the man could not substantiate his claim that if he were deported, he would face an immediate risk of being arbitrarily deprived of his life, which is true, as now 5 years later, the very powerful UN is lobbying on his behalf, and he's very much still alive. This climate refugee claimed that a lack of electricity, sanitation, and overcrowding on his island were caused by sea level rise, that would overtake his island in 10 to 15 years. The evidence presented to the refugee panel in New Zealand included, quote, compelling photographs provided by climate change expert John Corcoran that were, quote, largely ignored by domestic authorities. Oh, and he also presented 2 letters. Now, despite New Zealand being a completely sovereign nation with its own laws, the United Nations has gotten itself involved in this mess. And despite the fact that the UN committee had to admit that, quote, in the present case, there is no evidence that the author faced an imminent risk of being arbitrarily deprived of his life when he was removed to Kiribati. Moreover, there is no evidence that the author faces such a risk. There is no evidence that his situation is materially different from that of all other persons in Kiribati. The United Nations Committee determined that others in his position could indeed be refugees because, quote, both sudden onsets, such as intense storms and flooding, and slow onset processes, such as sea level rise, salination, and land degradation, can propel cross-border movement of individuals seeking protection from climate change-related harm. Now, anyone can see through this if they want to. The UN has no real authority except when progressive governments like ours give it to them.
Yes, and like ours as well.
Just like when the Liberals crafted their carbon tax goals around what happens at UN climate change conferences, you know, like the Paris Accord. When everything is climate change, then everyone is a refugee and your country's borders now mean nothing. Climate change is how national borders are going to be dissolved in the future.
Exactly. The redistribution of people from the third world to the first.
Anyway, this all got me thinking about what the Liberals have been saying about Canada's so-called climate emergency.
Our changing climate report has shown that with the changing climate, the island is going to be a lot rainier at times, but also more droughts. You're going to see much hotter days in the summer, so extreme weather that's going to have a real impact, and it's going to mean that mayors are going to have to be better prepared.
In Canada's western Arctic, the permafrost is melting and huge pieces of tundra are eroding into the ocean. And around Baffin Island, Inuit elders are finding it difficult to forecast the weather like they used to, so difficult that many are now reluctant even to try.
We have got an emergency here, and the party opposite is not telling the truth to Canadians. We are paying. We've gone from $400 billion a year to over $2 billion, to $400 million to $2 billion because of the cost of climate change.
We've declared a climate emergency. We're in very real danger. All that liberal hyperbole on climate change devastation here in Canada might be good news for Albertans wanting to take their oil and gas expertise somewhere that will appreciate it. Maybe Trump's fossil fuel utopia. I heard it was 13 degrees Celsius yesterday in West Texas, with an unemployment rate of 2.1%. Sounds like a refuge from Alberta's minus 45-degree weather and high unemployment rate to me.
Yes, well put. Now that reporter from Rebel News is correct. The UN can't force sovereign nations to take in these so-called climate change refugees. But nor was the UN Global Compact on Migration binding, and both Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern signed on to that, along with more than 160 other countries. So we will be the first targets on the UN's list to take in these so-called climate refugees.